do you want me to just talk
Nope.
about whatever or start asking you questions? Because I can ask you questions. We can reverse roles here if you want.
We can roll switch if you want. It's the whole point of a conversation. But welcome to Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Mr. Greg.
Hey.
Greg, please tell everybody why you're so awesome because I know why you're awesome, but they need to.
Well, presumably the reason I'm here rather than the reason I'm awesome. I have a little podcast I started back in March called the Godyssey podcast. Focuses on mythology from all around the world, essentially diving into why we look at these stories, why these stories have stayed with us, and what makes these gods humans and what these gods can tell us about humanity.
So, do you want my joke answer or do you want my really serious answer?
Yes.
Okay, I'll give which one you want first, the joke one or the serious one?
Let's go with the joke.
So I've been playing Assassin's Creed, the new one, and I guess you were a targeted ad in my mind because I was like, I want to learn more about Odin and all this stuff. I know
Hmm.
a bit, but I wanted to learn more. And next thing I know, I came across your podcast and I was like, well, this is a sign from the gods. This is like a symbol that we must meet. And then the serious one is I think that mythology is really interesting. And what I love about it, same thing kind of with religion, is the basis of personifying objects. It's so much more badass to fish. If you can think that a giant sea god with a starfish on his dick is like is blessing you with an awesome fishing harvest. Like it to me, Poseidon, Greek mythology, everything. And I have a person I need to connect you with. Her name is Dr. Valerie, got her PhD in Greek mythology and Roman architecture. But she has this like we went off about Greek mythology, how awesome it is. And I think it's the idea that you give something you're passionate about, whether it's fishing, whether it's harvest, and you put your belief into something. And to
Hmm.
watch
Yes,
that transform through tales of demigods, of people that are half man, half god, people with, abilities, it makes life way more fucking fun. I'm just
it does.
saying.
Yeah, essentially, like, we choose to personify all these different things, and it's not just like the natural world around us. It's also things like the ideas of love and actions and oaths and things like that. Like season one of Godyssey, I focused on the Irish god Lulamfada, and essentially he is the god of oaths and loyalty, more or less. That's one of his many things. He's also considered a solar god by some, but that's questionable. So essentially, he is the god of making sure that you are good on your word, even though he himself is a trickster and knows how to basically spin those words. Uh, and so essentially, like, yeah, there's the natural world around us that we kind of choose to personify in different ways. Like there's Poseidon, the sea god. There's Zeus, the sky god. There's Hades, who happens to live under the ground and has a lot of different stuff going on. And then they also have this all these other interactions. Like with the Norse gods in particular, there's actually kind of like the prelude to the major myths that we all know. There's this untold tale of this war between two different groups of gods, the Aesir and the Vanir. And the Aesir are kind of like the gods of ideas, more or less. Like Odin is the god of death. He's the gallows god. He's the god of honor and justice and all these other things. Thor is the god of humanity and defense of that, as well as kind of the natural world. But on the other side of that, the Vanir are the gods of kind of the natural forces. Like Frey is the god of kind of fertility and agriculture. His sister Freya is the god of kind of natural passions. And their father, Njord, is the god of the sea, kind of the Poseidon of the Norse. And essentially, like, these gods have to come together and kind of like essentially do this not just for their own sake but for the sake of the nine worlds, because if they don't, then the natural elements, the giants as we call them most often in English, will kind of destroy everything.
The Jotunheim is
Yeah.
like the
Hmm.
main. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Hmm.
How much did the Thor movie actually really mess it up? Because the Thor movie, the way you just described that, Freya was seen as like this dark goddess of war, not really seen as, which is Thor's sister, if I'm correct.
uh there's a lot of ways to interpret that, but typically Freya, as she has come down to us, is the daughter of Njord. Njord is this god, the god of the sea, whereas Thor is the son of Odin. In some versions, Freya is married to Odin. Sometimes she's seen as Frigg, which in the Thor movies is Thor's mom, which is inaccurate. But there's some question about whether or not Freya and Frigga are the same goddess, because essentially Freya exists. Let's see if I can remember this properly. Freya is found primarily in the Scandinavia and the Norse area, whereas Frigg no, Frigg is found in the Norse area. No, okay, sorry. Frigg is found everywhere in the Germanic pantheon. The Germanic pantheon includes the Anglo-Saxons, the Germans, different groups like that. Whereas Freya is primarily Scandinavian, and the myths that have come down to us have been primarily Scandinavian. One of the major things they kind of mess up in the Thor movies that bothers me is that Odin or Loki is not the brother of Thor. He is the blood brother of Odin. So essentially, like way back in the day, like they made a blood pact that anytime that Loki is in error or wrong, he will always have a seat at Odin's table, no matter what. Why? We don't know. That myth is lost to us. But basically, when Jack Kirby and Stan Lee got together, they decided that, hey, wouldn't it be more interesting if Thor and Loki were brothers? So
Fucking A,
the
man. They're messing up my mythology lessons, dude. I keep looking at it like, because I was playing the Assassin's Creed game, and the one thing where I was like, this might be a lot for some people out there, because as I don't know if you've played the new one yet, but
I've not.
if you're patrolling onto the Viking seas, it all takes place in the Viking era.
Mm-hmm.
When you're going into England for the first time, you come across a cathedral, a church, and on the church, they're like, "What's this? These English people, they build their homes in such silly ways." And the guy goes, "And they also put their God on the cross, and then they also worship him, and they do all these crazy things like eat his bread, which is the flesh." And I'm like, "Wow, they're attacking Christianity right now."
Mm-hmm.
And then like they were like, "How silly of that. They don't want to fight to the great halls of Valhalla." But as you're playing through the game, you finally kind of not really die, but you enter what they call the Animus, which is like a simulation, but it was a
Mm-hmm.
simulation of Valhalla. It was a constructed thing. And he enjoyed it on the fact that he was able to feast and then fight. And he was more powerful, and he felt like it was like ecstasy being in that realm. You would fight and you would get like your strength was 50 times the Hulk. So you were like, holy crap, I'm inhuman. And then
Right.
next thing you realized, the battle would start over, and it'd be this whole replay scenario. Everything was replay where you just feast and fight, feast and fight. And he
Mm-hmm.
goes, this isn't what I wanted Valhalla to be. This isn't fun at all. And then like it was like this conflicting thing. Everything he's been fighting and killing for to finally get there has kind of shifted him into a place where he realizes, wait, this isn't just a hall of heroes and great warriors. This is also like it's kind of like being stuck in like the ether. Like you're the same
Mm-hmm.
shit on replay.
Yes, and that's one of the when warriors die in Norse mythology, they go to Valhalla and they're called Inheryar. Inheryar essentially are kind of forced to basically you died a warrior's death, you're going to live a warrior's afterlife, which is constant battle. And the reason for that is that Odin is essentially kind of trying to collect the greatest warrior souls so that he has the best possible army for Ragnarok. Essentially, Odin has this curse that he knows the future. He knows what's coming. He knows Ragnarok is on the horizon, and he is doing everything within his power to, if not stop it, then mitigate the destruction because it will destroy the nine worlds. And unfortunately, he also knows that he is cursed to failure. So everything he's done, like when he sends out his Valkyrie to go pick up these dead souls, um, he knows that he is essentially condemning these people to a lifetime or an afterlife, I guess, of constant death. And I guess the plus side of that is you get to eat and kill people constantly. So it's kind of
How many
refining their
people would
souls,
you
but
kill for a taquito?
yeah, basically like, hey, you stole my leg of mutton. I'm gonna have to cut your head off tomorrow. Which I imagine build up a lot of grudge matches as going into the future.
It's
Because
a
like, how do you
simpler
maintain
time.
discipline among the dead?
It's a simpler time, man.
I guess it is, yeah. But then part of it also bothers me with that is that he knows that this is coming, but he isn't quite like a lot of the actions don't quite add up. So one of the first myths that most people get pointed to is Voluspo. Voluspo is Odin goes to a basically a wise woman who can tell the future, like the Oracle of Delphi. He goes to her, she's dead, and he goes to her spirit and says, hey, what's going on? Tell me about the future. And so she tells him about the future. She lays it all out. She lays out that Thor is going to be slain by Jormungandr, that he is going to be eaten by the wolf Fenrir, all these things. And despite that, the father of these creatures is Loki. So there's a lot of motivation questions going on there. Is Odin keeping Loki around so he can keep an eye on him up until Ragnarok? Or is Odin like why is Odin keeping Loki so close to him? Because he knows that Loki has fathered all these children. He's fathered Hel, the goddess of the realm of the unglorious dead, uh, which the Thor movies didn't quite get accurate, but made a lot more interesting, I thought. Because typically she just sits down there and she's really just kind of brooding and cold. But whereas in the Thor movie, she's just Kate Blanchett hamming up everything.
Wait, is
Uh,
that the woman with the giant wolf?
yeah, giant wolf. Yeah. And I forget it in the movies if they make that wolf Finra or Garm. There's two different wolves. Hell has a wolf, but I think they made that Finra.
See, I like Norse mythology just because I've been playing the shit out of Assassin's Creed. But
Hmm.
like, I'm so interested in the Greek mythology only on the basis of I think that one gave the closest representation to our culture today because we pull a lot of things from the Greeks, we pull a lot of things from the Romans. But when we look at not only like maybe our playwrights or arts and all these crafts and inventions we have today, but more on the lines of what we consider, I guess, easily understandable for us, having a god that represents the sea, and then the language barriers, not so much different compared to with Norse mythology, is completely different. Where maybe if we were in Scotland, it would make more sense.
Well, I'm going to push back against that because English is a Germanic language. So if you listen to somebody speak German, it's semi-intelligible if you know what to listen for. But whereas Greek and whatnot, they follow in Greek is a completely different language family, but Latin and the Romance families, they so English is this weird hodgepodge language. Essentially, English over time has evolved to be more or less 27% French, 27% German, and a little less Latin. And then you throw in some other, like we picked up words from Spanish, we picked up words from Greek, all these different things. So
Taco.
we use the basic framework of German, but we have some stuff we've brought over, like pronunciation, like where we've essentially gotten the German words and we've corrupted them using French. So, like, let's think of a good example of that. All of our days of the week, for example, come from the Norse. So, like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, those are all Norse gods. So, Monday is Muna, Tuesday is Tyr, Wednesday is Odin, Wotan. Thursday is Thor, Friday is Frigga or Freya, depends on how you want to look at it. Saturday is the only day in the English language that we get from the Romans, from Saturn. And then Sunday is from Suna or Sol, who is a sun goddess. And then essentially we have a lot of other things there, but I would say that we do, particularly in America, like to build up this idea that we are descended culturally from the Greeks and Romans, and we are. We essentially we have our government, we have a lot of our ideas, the traditions of arts and sciences, the way we build up education. All of those are in a very strong manner of thinking Greek and Roman as they have come down to us. Now, that's not to say that the Greeks didn't get their ideas from the Mesopotamians, because that continuum goes back much, much further than the Greeks. We pretend like basically starting about 700 BCE, the Greeks just kind of go for it. But before that, basically every idea the Greeks had prior to just building up their philosophy and some other stuff like democracy, they get it from the basically the Middle East. They get it from the Egyptians and from the Mesopotamians. But we also focus a lot on things like we get it Romans, but we also have about 100 years ago there were a lot of people pushing that essentially, oh no, we're not Greek and Roman. They're not like us. We're more Germanic. So like for example, Teddy Roosevelt's thesis when he was at university in the 1800s was that America is not descended from a Roman Senate. We're descended from a German thing. So a thing is, and this is actually Iceland still calls their parliament a thing, is essentially a council where a bunch of people come together and they talk about things, and then they make it's more or less just a general legislative body, kind of like our House of Representatives. And so his argument in his thesis, and he was wrong, was that basically we get all of our ideas about culture and strength and masculinity from the Germans, from the Norse, the Vikings, because the English, as we all know, are Germans. So, and then of course we have World War I, and people were like, maybe we should downplay that a little bit.
I just look at if you look at Greek mythology or Roman mythology has been easily, I guess,
Hmm.
manipulated or has a bigger presence in the media
Yes.
when it
Hmm.
comes to any type of movies that come out. Like, I mean, all the time, my first inspiration was Hercules, the Disney movie.
Oh
And
yeah.
then
Hmm.
that evolved into a lot of stuff that we learned through our culture in school and our education system is based on Greek mythology. So, like, and Roman mythology, learning the
Oh yeah.
planets, Saturn, everything like that. And
Hmm.
our obsession with space, you start figuring out, wait a minute, what's the name of Pluto? Pluto is Hades, or
Hmm.
Pluto is this whole
Yes.
other. And then that's when it finds into that. But like Norse mythology was like this thing you really had to finally dive
Yes. Hmm.
into.
Yeah.
That now that's getting light. So I'm looking at all the different types of lore and what's going to be hit next, because we've been, at least on my understanding, is that we've been kind of influenced with a lot of folk tales and legends
Hmm.
and myths based on Greek mythology. I mean, Percy Jackson is a top hitting series, but all
Oh yeah.
those legends and stuff got taught to you when you were in school.
Hmm. Yeah, so like essentially, since that's been high culture for centuries, basically like Shakespeare's talking about all these things. Like he's using all these references, and therefore it becomes embedded in English high literature, high culture, high theater. And so basically these have now come down to us that these are the things we're taught in school because they are important. They are high culture. High culture is important to teach to kids because it influences their lives. Never mind that they can't balance a checkbook. But
I can't
basically,
balance checkbook.
but essentially we've got this idea that this is high culture, and now we're starting to look around and realize that hey, all these other cultures have this too. Like so the Norse is kind of something that we have started kind of to incorporate into our culture. I think it had a lot more of effect in England, where they had like translations that were a lot closer. A lot of people in England, I mean, they can read other languages, so they can read them in German or they can read them in Icelandic. Whereas in America, it wasn't until Bellows that we really got a good translation of anything Norse. Whereas we've had access to Greeks and Romans for centuries at this point, and everybody like they come out with a new translation every so often. Like I have Edith Hamilton sitting over here in my little library of mythology I've got handy over here. Uh, but I think in reference to talking about like what's next, the Norse is something that we're starting to get a lot more interest in part because of Marvel. But even with that, I think that they're going to start introducing in the Marvel movies characters like Hercules, and they're going to maybe do other mythologies as well. Because I mean, we've already hit Ragnarok, we blew up Asgard. What's next? And I mean, in the Marvel comics, Hercules is a really big hero. He's a member of the Avengers and all that other stuff, so he's a natural choice. As far as our cultural obsessions, one thing that's always bothered me is that we have had access to, and in America, we have a lot of Celtic influence, and we haven't had a lot of Celtic mythology. We've kind of completely ignored Welsh mythology. We have completely ignored Irish mythology, and the Irish mythology has come down to us more or less intact. Like they're still called gods, whereas in Wales they had to sanitize it and change them to, oh, she's a princess. She just happens to have magic powers.
Do you
It's
think
okay. She's
that's
not a goddess.
Do you think that's because of the fact of how barbaric the Nordic culture is compared to the other cultures? Like the Greeks are still pretty savage, but a lot of it seems a lot cleaner in their stories rather than the Nords are always about fighting and brutality. Seems like if you're going to build a society like America or something, you
Hmm.
wouldn't want your influence to be filled on top of war, even though that's what we do every single day.
I think it's one of the we more or less build up these myths that essentially, oh well, these Vikings are just they're awful people that go around doing all this stuff. In reality, they were a lot like I mean, the Vikings themselves, people who go Viking, the act of Viking, that's itself a very like destructive action, and we only focus on that. We don't focus on the people who remained in Norway who were farmers. We don't really focus on like the Norwegian kings and all the things that are happening back in Norway. We're only focusing on the warrior culture that goes out and more or less founds these little kingdoms, more or less, just like
I burned somebody's
in
house down
Valhalla.
in my video game for no apparent reason. I
Exactly.
just grabbed a torch. The
Hmm.
mission was just toss it at the farmer's house. The house burned down, and the dude was like, "Well, I guess we're gonna have to move." I'm like, "You're not gonna sit on this pile of ash and cry for a couple of days. That's what I'd do if my house and all my belongings burned down."
Yes. Uh, uh, One of the things we also like to ignore is that essentially for a long time, the Greeks were the place that the more civilized cultures went to for mercenaries. They would go over to places like Turkey, where they had the Ionian Greeks, and they'd go and say, "Hey, we've got all this gold. If you want it, you can come over here and help me retake my city state." So basically, the Greeks would be paid during, I guess we call it the Mediterranean Dark Age or the Bronze Age. Basically, this is when all the myths took place, according to Greek mythology. So in Homer and all these other things, these things are taking place in the Mediterranean Dark Age, which was about 1200 BCE, so about 3,000 years ago. So the Greeks were essentially this pseudo-barbaric culture who was brought in by these civilized, settled city-states that had been like basically they'd been set up for a couple thousand years at this point. And so they were brought in and basically like, hey, come help us do stuff. And eventually that's what happened with the Norse, is where they said, hey, why don't you come over here and be a mercenary and help me retake this part of Wessex or this part of Essex? And basically, over time, the major factor for the part of this is that the Christianization meant that, well, we don't go do that to Christians. We only do that to pagans. So when the Vikings are eventually converted to Christianity, it becomes less, shall we say, religiously allowable for them to go and do that to Christians. Now, if you want to go do that to, say, Muslims or Jews, that's fine, but you can't go do that to other Christians. So essentially, that kind of sanitizes them over time. And as far as writing down myths, that's one of the things that is kind of miraculous about the Norse, is that typically when Christians choose to write down the myths of people that they have recently Christianized, they kind of demonize things, they kind of change things up. Whereas in the Norse myths, Snorri Sturluson kind of like, I'm going to keep this as close to possible to what I was told growing up. And so he chooses to kind of write them down. These are still gods. These are still people who are kind of don't have the same cultural values that he has, but they've also kind of been sanitized, because we know that essentially certain things about Odin, Loki, Tyr, Thor, Freya, Frigg, all these people have kind of been changed, and we're only getting a snapshot of them circa the 1300s. Uh, Whereas we have all these, like, basically all these stories written down by Christian monks about, like, oh God, the Vikings came, they kind of burnt down the monastery for the fourth time.
Yeah,
We
but they're
gave
only
them as
getting
much
one.
gold as we could, but
They're only
what
getting
can you do?
they're only getting one side of the story there. They don't know
Exactly.
the idea. Like if you fight on like in I'm gonna keep referencing Assassin's Creed, especially if we're talking about Norse mythology. But as I'm playing, like you realize these people are seeing you in a completely different light than you see yourself, because your
Hmm.
basis of what you're going off of is what you've been told for so long.
Hmm.
When you're pulling out research for this stuff, are you just reading text and you're soaking up the information? Like where do you find, I guess, your specific, because you cover the scale here. You're not just dealing with Norse stuff, you're dealing with other stuff too. Where's
Right.
your tickle button, your niche?
I primarily try to do so. I'm an academic by trade. I'm a trained historian, and I work as a writer, so I do a lot of research.
I couldn't
Uh,
tell. I'm just fucking tossing shit
that
at
may
me.
come as a surprise.
I'm sitting there trying to nod my head like, yep, I'm getting it. I'm getting it.
Hmm. So essentially, I try to go to the original source as best I can. Now, I don't read the 14th century Icelandic. It's just something that I have not started on yet. Maybe I'll get to it one day. So I'm going to essentially translations of the primary sources. Basically, right now I'm using Bellows for the Norse. For the Irish, I used a lot of different sources. They have a lot of different things where they've written down different legends, and a lot of it was written in Latin, or some of it was written in Old Irish. And I don't speak. My Irish is just really bad. uh, which actually, I got an email about it when I was writing season one, and I was still in the process of it. I got an email from an Irish woman who's living in Vancouver. She said, "I'm so glad that someone is telling these stories, but I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that you have been mispronouncing the name of the gods."
Just be happy it's there.
Yeah, part of me was like, I mean, it's a good thing that I'm telling this story, but on the other hand, it's like, I have been saying the name of the gods wrong for 25 episodes before you even told me that.
It's the thing though is you're talking about something that has been so long forgotten by a lot of our culture. It's
Hmm.
like you expect someone to be able to understand Greek or Latin handwriting when we stopped teaching fucking cursive in like first grade. It doesn't make sense. So you can't please everybody, obviously, but the fact that you're getting close is pretty damn awesome. I mean, this is something I've been binge listening to. I don't listen to a whole lot of podcasts. I try and keep my head clear, but like this has been like this is the secret for me. This is like my inner nerd comes out where I'm like, I love Greek mythology, I love Roman mythology. I think it's so awesome because a lot of it correlates to how we're dealing with life.
Hmm.
I talked to a molecular neuroscience on the podcast, and he was explaining this whole way of like how people have kind of evolved from the past. And I was like, a lot of it seems like the movie Clash of the Titans, where instead of receiving love and getting or a praise from that, we're much like Hades, feeding on all the bitter resentment that's around in our culture, trying to pick at people for what they don't have. And it's like pushing fingers and starting fights. We've learned to feed off that rather than feed on the love and admiration of each other. I mean,
Hmm.
a lot of that, it makes things better. And if you look at scenarios where a god might be of something, and that's the reason why they had so many, was because that's where I look at that and say, this is why it's easier for us to understand in America, because it's not so superhero-y. When you can give a god a specific job or ability, like Poseidon,
Mm-hmm.
king of the sea. But then you have Thor that has multiple different powers where it's like, fuck it, let's just toss in like the guy who has all the super, like Captain Marvel. She has every fucking power, I think. So I'm like, I look at that, I'm like, well, that's not my favorite, because that would just be like picking the top dog and being like, fuck the rest. I want
Right.
Spider-Man because he's a kid and he's also like, he's got his hormones going and all he does is shoot webs. He
Mm-hmm.
can still be beat.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons like we're drawn to mythology that reflects us. So essentially, whenever we see the gods having these like brood fests where they're going out and they're just throwing a hissy fit because somebody doesn't like them, that's relatable to us. That's relatable in the sense that, well, if somebody doesn't reciprocate our feelings, maybe I'm going to go have a hissy fit. Uh, that said, the gods are also incredibly misbehaved, and as it happens, so is humanity. The gods that are more distant and more kind of just well behaved, I would say the Egyptian gods are much more well behaved than any of the gods we've talked about so far. Like they are just like they're the gods of kind of like here's their set ideas, but also they can do all this other crazy crap. And basically, whereas the Norse gods like Thor, like I would say Marvel Thor has more powers than actual mythology Thor. Like Thor is incredibly strong. The reason why he's strong is he has like gauntlets on that helps him lift Mjolnir. He has Mjolnir, but unlike the movies, he doesn't really have a lot of control of lightning. Now, he's called the Thunderer for a lot of reasons. It's said that whenever thunder happens, that's Thor fighting the frost giants. So that was kind of the old way of thinking of that, and kind of like how they chose to personify thunder. And in German, the word for thunder is Donner. Donner is very close to the old German way of saying Thor. So basically, like they chose to personify that. But then Thor also does all this stuff where basically, like, he is incredibly no nonsense. He is very unapproachable and also very rude, but he also is occasionally humbled at times. There's this episode where this giant is having him, his human manservant, and Loki, because he and Loki always go on adventures. They have them do these impossible tasks, and Thor is asked to pick up a kitten the size of more or less a cart, and he can't pick it up, and he can't figure out why. So for the rest of the night, he's just kind of like, I guess I'm not as strong as I thought I was. And then the next day, the giant's like, I was just messing with you. That was the Midgard serpent. You can't pick him up. He's the biggest thing in the universe. And so Thor's like, well, maybe I am as strong as I think I am. So basically, like, it shows that Thor has these dynamic emotions. All of the Norse gods have these dynamic emotions, and the Greek gods too. They have a lot of incredible emotions. Uh, I guess one of the major differences between the Greek and Norse gods in that sense is that the Norse gods have less direct interaction in the myths with the humans who worship them. Whereas in the Greek myths, it's primarily, okay, well, this person was born of Zeus who came down in the form of a swan and decided that he was going to get busy and blah, blah, blah. Basically, the gods are direct actors in human affairs. In the Norse myths and in the way of talking about them in English and German and the Scandinavian languages, those come to us and we have certain phrases about the gods, but we don't really necessarily connect to them as like active agents in our world because Asgard is technically a different world. It's out there somewhere beyond the Rainbow
It's
Bridge.
like here's us and they're above us playing and they're
Mm-hmm.
doing their thing and we're just looking at it like we're observing and we're giving like personification to a storm, for instance. We'd be like, that's
Right.
Thor battling. When the
Mm-hmm.
Greek gods had influence into our lives, apparently from
Mm-hmm.
the stories and myths, they would come down here, mate, or do whatever. Zeus was the main
Right. And
guy.
like Olympus is a physical location. Like all the places in Greek mythology, like we can trace them to actual places. Like we think we have an idea of what they base the river Styx on. We know where the cattle raid or the cattle drive of Apollo was. Like we have all these specific places. Like this was a nymph of this place. Zeus was raised on Crete. So that's a real place. That's a place that people in ancient Greece would have known about. Whereas in Norse mythology, Jotunheim is somewhere out in the east.
So that makes it easier for us to be able to believe in that because that's some
Mhm.
things we can see.
Right.
But then how do you have such blind faith like a Viking to be able to kill something or kill somebody or pillage a town with a belief that you're going to go to this place and that's what they want you to do?
I guess that kind of gets back to just like how people choose to believe a lot of different things. Essentially, like how people construct their afterlife is very different. So, like the Greeks kind of, and we have a sanitized version of uh, the Greek afterlife, essentially like where people come to Hades and like they might go to Elysium or they might go to Tartarus or all these other places. That's a version. That's not necessarily the end all version, but basically like why is it that people go under the ground in Greek mythology? Like, why do they follow the river Styx and go to a place where the god of it is so terrifying that we have to name him after the place he lives, Hades?
You just explained to me Hollow Earth. Thank you.
And there's a lot of things like that where like so Herodotus, he wrote down all these things like there are these people who live under the ground south of Egypt. They're called troglodytes, and there's all these people who live under the ground and this really weird stuff. But and then essentially like we also have kind of lost some of the plot on it, where like Atlantis, for example, Atlantis was meant to be a metaphor when Plato came up with it. Like we aren't sure about anything else, and Plato wrote about it and it was so profound that everybody else starts writing about it. And so now in today's society we're like, oh, Atlantis must have been a real place. It was a metaphor originally, and we've
See,
kind of, a lot of people have kind of lost that. But
that's the weird part about it is because they said they found Atlantis, and what it was I'm pretty sure that it was a city that was built on a cliff, and what happened was when the plate shifted after an earthquake, it just
mm-hmm,
drifted into the sea. I don't
mm-hmm,
think Plantis or Atlantis, whatever, was ever a real place. I think Plato was just like Orwell. He was trying to create a War of the Worlds like fucking
right,
story, and people
mm-hmm,
ran with that. But that's what's crazy, is why I wish I can go back in time to be able to see this shit and be like, what is going on? Like, what are you thinking? And the dude's writing down on a notebook, like, I have an idea for a story. And I'm like, all right, well, let me hear the story and see how we've taken that, and with the storytelling effect, have
mm-hmm.
ran with it and turned it into something that's completely not. And honestly, through this podcast, you've made me hate the Marvel universe for how much they've gotten wrong. Because now I'm looking at Thor 100% different.
Yeah, now Thor in essentially Jack Kirby, Stanley latched onto one story. It was like, okay, Thor has to be humbled. He has to be banished down to earth. And he went with that. And so essentially everything after that is kind of like Thor basically building himself up. So Thor is the defender of humanity. He's the defender of Midgard against all of these natural forces. Uh, and he's kind of like, all right, that's the Thor I'm going with. I'm not going with the Thor who is constantly threatening Loki because Loki is up to, basically Loki causes all the problems of the gods, but he also solves all the problems of the gods. So basically like Loki is the guy that you want to come hang out with you, but you don't really want to talk to him because he has all this cool stuff. He has all these magical powers. He knows he knows a guy for everything.
He's the
Whereas
dude from
in
Pawn Stars that always like, well, I
uh-huh,
got a guy for that.
exactly, like Loki always has a guy for that, and he'll just shapeshift into whatever animal, go find it, and then come back and say, hey, that guy said that, yeah, he's the one who stole Mjolnir. Um, and basically like they chose certain elements, and like so basically Odin is closer to just our general traditional sense of like the Judaic god, and kind of with a little bit of Zeus, and he just happens to be missing an eye. They don't really go into that. And then like up until about 10 years ago, Freya just wasn't a part of the Marvel comics. She just wasn't there. There was a chick called Enchantress, and she was there, and she
She
was
was
kind of there.
She was in Suicide Squad.
Oh, that's DC, so that's a completely different universe.
I fucking hate this clash of rivals between Marvel and DC.
Well, I mean, if we keep going this way, probably Disney will buy DC too, and we'll have a combined. No, I hope we don't. I actually
They
prefer them
ruined
to
the
be
Star
separate.
Wars universe. Don't do that. That's a lore people get behind. There's like top threes. There's like Greek mythology, Norse mythology, and
Mhm.
then you got Disney mythology, which is like, this is the Star Wars universe. But then there's like, I like accurate representations in movies. And one of my favorite, I do believe, even if you hit on the slight instance of somewhat truth, it
Mhm.
helps people realize this might be interesting to go research into, and then you learn the actual truth. Like when I
Mhm.
first saw Hercules, I looked up the actual research into Greek mythology and realized how
Mhm.
much of it was bullshit. I
Yes, the
mean,
movie's absolutely awful.
Hera was the like the perfect, like the one, like the jealous, wife that was loyal,
Mhm.
and Zeus went around banging everything, so she tried to kill all of his children. But in
Yep.
the Disney thing, she loved Hercules. I'm like, that's bullshit. She was
Mhm.
behind the whole plan, and
Yeah.
Hades in that movie invented what are those, by the way.
That's true. That's 100% true.
He looked at those air Hercs and he said, what are those? And I was like,
Mhm.
that's where it came from.
Uh, I try like so I was trying to show my kid that, and like he's just for some reason he cannot latch on to Disney movies. He loves Cars, he loves Pixar, but he can't really do like Disney movies. I showed him Hercules and he made it about 30 minutes before he got bored. So I was kind of like, all right, well, we have a gateway. So that's good. But
He didn't like Danny DeVito acting like a a really like a crazy Jew, I would say. As was his character. He was a satyr and he was just running all over the place complaining. I'm like, hang on a second. I don't complain at all. That's not me.
uh, for some reason, like specifically Phil in that movie is like, all right, well, I don't like this. He liked everything before that. He liked the flying horse. He liked the gods and their monocolors and basically all this stuff. But as soon as we got to the satyr, he was like, I'm gonna go play with my cars now. So, but
He
I'm hoping that
just
that can
doesn't
one day be
like
a gateway.
goats, man. He just doesn't like goats.
I can't blame him, to be perfectly honest. Goats terrify me.
The centaur thing I'm not a big fan of, but I'm a fan of like the half bloods, like the half kids, like
Hmm.
just to see the amazing powers and feats that people can look at and be like, that's a he's half man, that's half us. That means there is that
Hmm.
ability to have inside of us. I believe all these
Yeah.
tales and all these folklore, like that's a crazy myth. There's a reason why it's a myth, and I'm glad we know it's a myth. We glad we know it's a story. We know it's a folklore. It's not real, but it gives us a chance to be like, wow, they thought that, and that's what gave people inspiration.
Yes. Yeah, essentially like in Greek mythology we have all these embodiments of like here's one person, all right, here's one part of a personality. Let's make that an entire race of people. So, uninhibited libido, here are satyrs. They're all here. All of them are just all about sex and lust and kind of like natural urges. That's what they are. And so like basically all these other things were like, all right, so craftsmanship, let's make that the Cyclops, the Cyclopes or Cyclopes, depends on how you want to pronounce it. But basically like they choose like let's pick one part of it and make it into an entire race or make it into an entire peoples. And they just make it into like and Greek mythology is so expansive because so much of it has survived and come down to us. And not just that, the Romans took it and made it their own thing where they kind of built on top of it. Like that's one of my favorite things is that essentially the Iliad and the Odyssey are really fun, and you get to the Aeneid, and it's basically fan fiction. It just is like it's Roman fan fiction of Greek mythology, where basically like, all right, hey, you know that Odyssey, that Odysseus guy? Now he's a bad guy. Let's imagine that he's a bad guy because he's the one who engineered the fall of Troy. And as we know, we are descended from the Trojans. So now he's the bad guy who's constantly hunting for Aeneas across the
Dude, it's a lot
Mediterranean.
like TV today. Like when Kim Jong Un, they introduced the sister, and it's like it's the evil sister that no one knew about. And I was like, oh my god, it's just like we're watching a reality television
Mm-hmm.
show. They're just introducing
Yes.
characters at this
It's like
point.
it's a CW show. We're like, well, we haven't mentioned the sister all that much before. Why is she suddenly here? Where did she come from?
Because
We
we
don't
ran out
know.
of shit to write.
Basically.
If
Uh,
if you had to pick a lore to live in, which lore
ooh,
would you live in, and which one would you hate to live in?
mm. I am not exactly an expert on it, but I am pretty terrified of Mayan mythology.
Yeah.
Like Mayan mythology is like that is pretty fucked up.
That's
Like
the
there's
one I understand the most of like their concept of thinking was you eat this warrior because you consume his flesh and his energies. And I'm like,
mhm.
makes sense on that one, but I wouldn't want to do that. I don't think I'd ever want to know if I could smell like human ever.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I 100% am like it's interesting to me and I one day want to study it and I happen to have somebody who studies I know a archaeologist who goes and does research into Mayan culture and Mayan archaeology. And so I have somebody who can actually help me with the pronunciation. She named her cat after the maze god. So I can have somebody help me with the pronunciation on that one.
One of their
But the one I
floors in
would
their pyramid in the Mayan, one of the Mayan temples was straight for killing, where they sacrificed like 15,000 people. Like
Mhm.
it was kids, everything. I was like, what harvest were you hoping to get out of that? It didn't make any sense, but that was their plane of thinking. I was like, if I survived in those things, or if I even survived in that Mayan culture, I'd be dead like by the age of 7. I don't think I could do it right.
Mhm. Yeah, no, there's like a high infant mortality rate in a lot of these, and like there's even myths about a lot of that. But the one I would most want to live in, to go back to that, I think the reason I picked Irish mythology is because it speaks to me the most, and they would have places for me in their society. And so like I can look at these gods and say like I like everything that you are about. And basically a lot of connection with that. So like I'm a big fan of the Dagda, I'm a big fan of Nuada, I'm a big fan of Brigid and the Morrigan, even though the Morrigan is absolutely batshit insane terrifying. Um, but like the Irish, to me, the Irish gods are incredibly relatable, but also I think it's partially because when I was in Ireland, I went and I visited places where these gods had lived and died. Like you can visit this place that this is the burial site of Lugh, this is the burial site of the king of the Firbolg, and all these different places. And it felt incredibly like, and essentially like the Irish are still talking about these things in kind of like a present day sense, like a present tense. Uh, they know that like these are our old stories. These are kind of like we have twisted the story a lot, and these are the original settlers. So whether or not you want to interpret them as gods or ancestors, that's entirely up to you. Or fairies. A lot of times you could just say they're fairies. Um,
That means a
and
different word today.
yes. Uh, but basically, to them, it's a way of just essentially casting the physical world around them in a very real sense. And that's very, it speaks to me a lot. The other side of that is that I have a master's degree in Japanese. And basically, Japanese mythology, like I have.
No, no. It has that one woman with the really giant eyes, and she's like a devil. I'm not in it. No.
Their concept of things like the underworld and whatnot, yeah, that now that's terrifying. And once you mix in Buddhism, that gets even weirder because then essentially your soul is kind of trapped in this perpetual reincarnation cycle. But Shinto in particular has been a particular like favorite of mine for most of my life. Essentially, since I was a kid and basically kind of latched onto it. Like this is before Miyazaki and all that. That people kind of got into that. So like before Spirited Away kind of introduced it to an American society, I had like these books that would introduce it to me and all these other things. And so Japanese mythology has been a favorite of mine. And then basically when it came down to it, I had to decide if I wanted to get a degree in Roman or Byzantine history or in Japanese history. And I decided to, you know what, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to go for Japan. Because I got into them at the same time when I was about 11. And Japan is, I mean, I love Japan. Japan's amazing, but so is Rome and so are the Byzantine, who are basically the Eastern Roman Empire. Um, and so I more or less have divided my interest across all of my favorite mythologies and all my favorite cultures of the world. And so studying their history, their culture, and how they interact with one another, because that's another thing is that all of these different mythologies are incredibly cosmopolitan. Like they borrow from each other all the time. Like we pretend like they're separate, and like we want the Greeks to just be Greek. But the Greeks have all these things that they have borrowed from the Phoenicians, from the Mesopotamians, from the Assyrians, the Hittites, and from their neighbors to the north, like the Hyperboreans and like Boreas, the north wind. He's from Thrace. Those are the neighbors directly north of the Greeks. So the north wind is just the king of these northern neighbors. That's a real place that they could point to. Uh, and essentially, Aphrodite is basically verbatim the exact same as the Mesopotamian love god, a goddess, I should say. Like Ishtar and Aphrodite are almost exactly the same. Like when the Babylonians pointed to Venus in the sky, that was their love god in the sky. Just like when the Greeks pointed to Venus, that was their love goddess. I mean, they also called her the morning star.
She
So
was
that gets into
born of
some
sea
other.
foam,
Mm-hmm.
which
Yes.
is really nuts because then once you start bringing in like Gaia into the conversation, you're like, you're going to fight the fucking earth. Like it doesn't make any sense. Like you hear all these battles of like Zeus or whatever, some name whoever versus Gaia, and I'm like, you're battling the fucking planet you live on. Well, how far do you think you're gonna go? You make peace, and she sucks you into the floor whenever she feels like it.
Essentially when you look at cosmologies like that with the Greeks, like because the Greeks have a lot of different cosmologies about where we came from and whatnot, and Gaia is just like she's part of this larger cult of earth goddesses and earth gods because like Hades is technically an earth god because if you go underground where Hades is, that's technically under the ground. So Dionysus, Demeter, Persephone, Gaia, Rhea, all these different gods, they're all earth gods. And so they're all part of this larger continuum of gods. And so Gaia is kind of like this more distant, and some historians and archaeologists think that Gaia may have been more important before she was written down by the Greeks. Like she may have had like prior to the the Mycenean culture, she may have been more important, but there's questions about that. But basically, yeah, like we have these personifications of like she's the earth, and then like we have chaos, who's kind of like where everything came from.
How are they finding more information? Are they just finding more relics and stuff where it might predate before something else be discovered?
Kind of. So
Because
they're finding
I don't
relics.
trust it all now because the fact of Disney. I feel like Disney's like,
Hmm.
we found
Yes.
this archaeological fact. And you're like, what's that about? And he goes, it actually predates this. I'm like, you're telling me Captain
Mhm.
America helped Gaia stop Thor? What the fuck?
So with a lot of these things, with the Greeks, we have a continuum of like, here are the ancient Greeks that we know. Here's Athens and Sparta. Then you go back about 400 years, completely different set of city states are important. They do completely different things with their gods. And we have, oh, here's some writings that have come down to us. They're in a very different form of Greek. And then you go back a little further, and it's the Myceneans. The Myceneans are, it's a city state that is mentioned a lot. Like, so Agamemnon's the king of Mycenae. And Hercules is technically in service to the king of Mycenae. In like basically when he has to do all of his labors, he's doing them because the king of Mycenae is telling him to do them. And so you go back a little further, and you go to the Crete. You go to Crete to the Minoans, and the Minoans, they have a different form of Greek that we can't even read yet. They have linear A and linear B. We can kind of read linear B, but we can't read linear A. And so they have a lot of things where like we can point to gods and say that looks like it's Artemis, but she's not a virgin, she's not a maiden, and she's a queen. She's definitely a goddess, and she's
She's a
definitely an
goddess of the hunt.
archer, but she's very different. That's different. And so, like, instead of him being called Zeus, he's going by one of his titles that, like, by the time of the ancient Greeks, that's just one of his many titles. Like, you would say, like, Thundering Zeus or Wise Zeus. Instead, his name back in the days of the Minoans, and this is an example, this isn't verbatim, but like, his name might have just meant wisdom, or it might have meant thunderer. And like, his name is essentially, it evolves over time. And so we're eventually learning to read these things. And we're starting to think that maybe we can get linear A, because we have a lot of documents in linear A that we could potentially use a computer algorithm to read them. Essentially, like we can break into it and figure out like what these mean. Like, essentially, here's a sequence of characters in the proto alphabet. What do they mean? And essentially, we could potentially use a computer to decipher that. That's a thought. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen, but we're more or less discovering more as we find more documents, because as it happens, everything we used to write things on is pretty easy to destroy just with the passage of time. So we're essentially, it's luck that we're finding a lot of these.
It all boils down to what is your concept on this earth that we're on? Where does it stay? Is it on the back of a fucking turtle? Is it being held up by a giant jacked Arnold guy? Like,
Mm-hmm.
what is the concept of what do you want to believe and what do you find is the route that you want to go down? And honestly, if I was gonna pick a god that I had to personify for myself, it'd probably be Prometheus, because I would end
Yes.
up doing something to help somebody, and then I would end up getting fucking tortured for all of mankind.
Yes. And no, Prometheus has always been one that I've always latched onto, which has also, for the exact same reasons, Prometheus is almost exactly like John Milton's version of, not exactly, there's a lot of differences, but Prometheus has a lot of things in common with Loki and a lot of things in common with Satan, in the sense that
Boy, I
like
got mixed up.
Prometheus chooses to bring to us fire, chooses to bring to us civilization. And he's tortured in much the same way that Loki is tortured underneath, essentially, uh, Loki is tortured because a snake is kind of has its mouth open above him and it's dripping on his face constantly. And his wife is kind of occasionally getting it, but she has to pour out the bowl. So sometimes it gets on his face, and he's bound by Odin to this rock for all of eternity. And Prometheus is bound to this rock for at least until Hercules comes and lets him out, to this rock for doing something that was against the gods. And in different versions of different lore about Satan, there's a lot of different things where he's done things to kind of like maybe help humanity. So, like, why did he want Eve to eat the apple? Or if you go with the Yazidi version of Satan, he's not called Satan, he's called something different. He is essentially, he was told by God to bow before no one. All the other angels bow before humanity when God tells them to. He stops and says, hey, wait, you told us not to bow before anyone. I'm not going to do it. And so because of that, God makes that version, which I like to call Peacock Satan because he's a peacock. Uh, Peacock Satan, he makes him into the king of angels, more or less, where he's kind of like the Lord of angels because he was the only one who listened to God's original command that angels are above all other beings aside
kind
from
of
God.
kind of like the movie Legion, where Michael betrays uh,
Hmm.
God and all of his orders. You know that movie where they turn into like aliens and shit.
I remember having seen it, but it's been a minute.
It's fucking. He's like, I didn't give him what he wanted. I gave him what he needed, and I was like, damn, great quote. And then I gave him the thumbs up. You know what I mean? But
Hmm.
it is that concept of there. It seems like everyone that is considered evil, even though they do have this evil kind of intent inside of them, which I believe is spurred upon a force back, I would say, against a higher power or something that's telling them what they
Hmm.
need to be and what they need to do. And I think that's why man closely relates to that a little bit on the concept of we are always told what to do, but doesn't mean we always have to follow orders like a soldier. It means we need to still be ourselves at times, and especially in times of struggle.
Hmm. Yes. And that's why we always fall back on these gods that are relatable. So, like, when you are getting on a boat to sail across the North Sea to go raid the English coast, you need a god on your side that looks like what you're about to do. That's why they prayed to Tyr. That's why they prayed to Odin. That's why they prayed to Thor, that these are war gods who are going to help them. And they also had on their side these Valkyrie who were going to come and take them to Valhalla. So you have all these different gods that look like you that are coming with you and to give you hope and to give you power. So like essentially before you use like Odin, give me the strength to defeat your enemies, and if I am to fall, bring me to your halls. So basically, like you're a very cynical way of looking at it is you're hedging your bets. Is that okay? If I end up succeeding, it's because Odin wants me to. If I end up failing, that's okay. Odin will bring me to his halls.
If you're holding the axe.
Yes. So basically, different things like you have to have die with an axe in your hand and all these
Nobody
other
says
things.
that fine fucking detail. The dude just kills himself, and next thing you know, he's like, "Wait a minute, I didn't have my axe." And it's like, "Oh, well, now you're going somewhere else."
Yes. And we like to ignore a lot of different things in Norse mythology. Like, so Valhalla specifically for the people who die in glorious battle, but then like there's other places you can go to. We just don't talk about it. So like Frey is the god of like people who die who are good. So otherwise, if you look at it, there's either like you die gloriously in battle, or you go and you have to build a ship out of toenails in Helheim.
You know how long that would fucking take if you don't have crazy glue? I know we're experiencing some technical difficulties. We have a thunderstorm going on here in Maryland too, so my internet's been going in and out. But we're gonna wrap the show, dude. You've given me plenty of time. I appreciate you for giving me a history lesson, dude. To be honest with you, this is like probably one of the podcasts I really didn't have to talk, and it was interesting to learn. I really enjoyed that. But please let everybody know, Greg, where they can find your podcast, where they can find all your links.
So we are primarily the biggest presence we have is on Twitter at the Godyssey podcast. There you can get pretty much daily during the week updates on different mythology. People pick different themes and I just go for it. I can also be found anywhere fine podcasts are sold. You just type in Godyssey and you can get the entirety of the first season. The second season drops next month. That's where we start getting into Odin. And otherwise, Godyssey has a presence on Facebook and we'll be getting an Instagram shortly, but those are in progress.
Works in progress, much like most of mythology.
There
Apparently,
we
you
go.
can add more shit to it.
Yep.